All right, this is our video lecture for last week's recent readings of the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural address, both of them written and delivered by Abraham Lincoln. First thing I want to say about the Gettysburg Address is that it is a eulogy. The word eulogy comes from the Greek and it means to speak well. And so if we write a eulogy, deliver a eulogy, it means often during a funeral, and it is an attempt to speak well of the dead. And so now we can go all the way back to Antigone, because part of Antigone's argument is to speak well for the dead. And when we think of those who can no longer speak for themselves, there are those who are the unborn. There are those who we might call them the marginalized, and certainly those who are no longer alive. And Lincoln, at the site for the Gettysburg Address, he was not the keynote speaker. The man who was asked to speak was a famous orator at the time, and he would deliver a speech that lasted about 2 hours, which was common in that time. People were not thinking that he was long-winded. That's what they showed up to hear and see. And according to some records, the man did a good job, and that Lincoln and Lincoln's assistants who were there would later write in praise of the speaker. But when we talk about Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address, we come to this brief remark that Abraham Lincoln made, and he was asked to come and speak and to just make a brief remark, and that's what he kept. It's fewer than 300 words. And when we read this, we see that he is speaking well of the dead, which might be more difficult to do than we think, because remember, this is after the Gettysburg battle, the Battle of Gettysburg, which is considered to be one of the most violent and fatal battles of the American Civil War, which means that soldiers on the Union Army and soldiers on the Confederate Army were killed. In fact, it's estimated that around 50,000 men lost their lives, and it was close to half and half for both the Union and the Confederate Army. So Lincoln could have, when he stood up, have just spoken in praise of the Union dead and spoken, hatred or criticism of the Confederate dead, and yet he chooses to do neither of those things. And yet I think he very subtly and respectfully makes a statement on which way he hopes that the war goes. So with knowing that it is a eulogy, his attempt to speak well of the dead, what it'd be worth you to do is go through the text and look for such phrases as brought forth. 77 years ago, which is 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition. And the word proposition means to put before. And once we entered into the Declaration of Independence, we have now entered into a phase of this semester where we're looking at what's called propositional arguments. An argument that you are putting forth, we hope, clearly. And the Declaration of Independence makes a clear argument. We're going to see an argument in the Gettysburg. We'll see it in the second inaugural. We'll see an argument in the letter from Birmingham jail. But we can also see arguments made in both Macbeth and Antigone. Individual characters making their arguments, and then the texts themselves making an overall argument or putting a proposition there for us to wrestle with and grapple with. If you can track through the language of this text, he uses again and again and again language that speaks of life. And then he also has that with language that speaks of death when he talks of those who gave the last full measure of devotion. When he talks of the honored dead. So stylistically, this is some higher concept stuff to work with, to think about. The word choice that he makes here keeps together this tension of both life and death. But from the opening paragraph, and this is really only 3 paragraphs in this piece, he makes a claim, a proposition that similar to what Haman does when Haman approaches his father Creon, the opening remark starts with something that the audience would agree with. 87 years ago, 1776, our forefathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived of the proposition that all men are created equal. His audience would have understood and agreed with that. Now, certainly there were those in the audience who would have thought, well, that might be the proposition, but we've not really lived that out as we should. And Lincoln would be among that group. But that is still what the language of the Declaration of Independence says. So start off with common ground. Then he moves into the second paragraph and says, now we're in this battle. And we're in a battle to see if this nation, such as ours, can survive. So there again is the idea of life and death. Can we live? Will we continue? Or will we fall apart? Will we be made into something different and lesser? Or we'll get to what he says at the very end. So again, to backtrack, his opening claim is a statement that the audience would agree with and understand. The second paragraph, he introduces a conflict that they are involved in, and yet what they have shown up to do. We are here to dedicate this land for those who fought, for those who lived and died, and fought that this nation can continue. The third paragraph, he starts with a conjunction, but. Now, you've probably been told earlier when you were writing, don't start a sentence with a conjunction, don't start a paragraph with a conjunction, but you can look at the second paragraph starts with the three-letter word now, and the third paragraph starts with the three-letter but. Those are excellent ways to start sentences or to start new paragraphs because they are tying together ideas. They work in addition, or in the case of but, it works as a contrast, right? And what he does in the third paragraph is he says, we have a problem. What we showed up here to do, we cannot do. We cannot dedicate this land any more than those who fought here have dedicated it. And then he uses a trifecta of three synonyms. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow. All of these words mean set apart for a distinct purpose. And there's the idea of a holiness, a sacredness, a religious rite. We cannot do that. What we showed up here to do, we cannot do. So then it begs the question, what can we do? Because Lincoln could have ended the speech there. We've shown up to dedicate this land, but it's been dedicated far above anything that we could do, so my speech is over. Instead, Lincoln pushes forward his big idea, and it's his big idea that we can find placed in the opening paragraph. We are a nation that was conceived with the idea that all men are created equal. And when we look at the last three sentences of this piece, I will not read them all, but you need to go back and track them on your own. And you'll see he says the same thing three times, just slightly differently each time. But look what he says here at the very end. We here, we the living, are highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth, a rebirth, a being born again, a almost type of resurrection, a new birth of what? Of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So we were conceived in the idea that all men are created equal. We're fighting a battle now to see if such a nation can survive. We're here to pay respect to the dead, but we really can't do that. Instead, what we can do is continue the work that those who fought here have done. They have fought for the survival of the nation, and I want the nation to survive. And here's where I think his argument for what side he hopes wins is a little more subtle. Not just that our nation will survive and come through broken and damaged only to fall apart later, but that we will have a new birth. What? A new birth of freedom. It was Lincoln's hope that this war would lead to the eradication of slavery, if not in his lifetime, in the not too distant future. And so then the freedom that the Declaration of Independence says, all men are created equal, will be aptly applied to all, not to some, and then others could be oppressed and ruled under the bondage of slavery. So beautiful argument. I mean, this is probably one of the highest things we're going to read this whole semester, and it is fascinating that it is also the shortest thing we will read. The last thing I want to say is with regards to the second inaugural address. Now, in the past, I've had students read Lincoln's first inaugural address because it is an excellent case study in logic. And it also provides a sharp contrast to some of the things we experience in the play Antigone. But we're not reading that this semester, although I would highly encourage you to go seek it out and read it. It's a much longer piece. The second inaugural is a short piece, and Lincoln does something as far as tactics goes. He makes it clear at the very beginning. During my first inaugural, I had to give this kind of speech. But during my second inaugural, I'm going to give a different kind of speech. And he tells us why. During my first inaugural, people wanted to know, what was the government going to do? Are we going to be able to avoid war? There were all these questions that I needed to attempt to answer. Now, those questions have been answered, and the question that's on everybody's mind is, what's happening with the war? He says, everyone's keeping well informed on the war. I can't offer you anything new about the war. And so then the thing everyone wants to talk about is, when will the war end and how will it end? And Lincoln uses a tactic called negation. Before he says what he's going to say, he first starts off with saying, this is what I'm not going to talk about. I am not going to make a prediction about how the war will end. So then what are we going to do? Well, what he does briefly is he lays out the origins of the war. He'll talk about the fact that everyone understands that the primary cause or the primary thing around which this war is circulating is that of slavery. So he distills all of the issues into one major issue. And he will move on and make some statements that I think are beautiful in their truth and in their composition. And they're also radical in a sense, if we thought of anyone saying something like this today. But I want to draw your attention to, he uses a type of speech pattern known as chiasmus. It's a Greek term which means a diagonal treatment. Go through and look at the phrases he has that will say one thing and then flip it on the other end. Like, here's a simple example from the text. This comes from the second paragraph. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. So at the beginning of the sentence, we have the word all, and then in the halfway through the sentence, we have the same word, all. But on both sides of the word, the subject, we have different verbs that are used. On the first part, everyone dreaded the idea of a war. And then on the second one, all of us tried to avert having a war. And it is worth your time to go through this text and look at his method of here, his use of chiasmus. All right, here's just one other example. In the same paragraph, it's at the bottom of the second paragraph, it says this. One of them would make war rather than let the nation survive. And the other would accept war rather than let it perish. It's a beautiful example of chiasmus, and then the paragraph ends in a very short sentence, and the war came, right? So another thing that Lincoln does in this speech, the American Civil War is still going on. He has, again, won the election for a second time. He will be dead not long after this speech is given. So the war's still going on. And he will make, on page 2, he'll have the longest paragraph when he talks about the origin of the war. And then what he does is he uses this language of the collective. We, right? This side this side that. But here's an example where he lays in a little more clearly where it is he stands. Listen to this. He will say, neither party expected the war, the magnitude, or the duration which it has already attained. Neither anticipated, right? Next sentence, each looked for an easier triumph. Next sentence, both read or read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid for the other, right? So here he's saying, look at how we're the same. Now he'll introduce where he'll introduce his picking of sides. Look at the next sentence. It may seem strange that any man should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces. So now we know where Lincoln stands. He is praying to a God. He is reading the Bible of that God. He is doing all that he can in the hopes that slavery will be eradicated. That's the side that he's on. And he says it seems odd that we would cry out to a just God to help us to continue to keep slavery going. And now he'll undercut that statement of his with a little bit of humor. But let us judge not, that we be not judged. So he levels a judgment against those who would want slavery to continue, and then pulls back a little bit with a little bit of humor by saying, let us judge not. But he's already got the statement out there. Then when we go to the last paragraph, right, I encourage you to read the rest of that second inaugural. What he says there is extremely beautiful. We'll come back to an element of it in just a second, but he is not looking to just say, you are wrong and we are right, and that's it. He is showing how both sides are responsible and guilty for this, and yet we know he's on the side that would want is maybe more right than the other, and yet his primary goal is not just to put a stake in the ground and say I'm right. His primary goal is to bring all together. And look at the last paragraph. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Here's the call to action for the audience. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in. Let's continue this war until we bring it to a close. To bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who should have borne the battle, who shall have borne the battle. So that means whether you fought for Confederate or Union, we will care for you, and for his widow, and for his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And we see in both the Gettysburg Address and the second inaugural that Lincoln drives towards a call to action. He does not just restate his opening points. He gives the audience something to both think about and do. In the Gettysburg Address, it's let's rededicate ourselves to carry on with this work so our nation can be reborn in freedom, and that our nation, and that such a nation will not perish from the earth. And here in the second inaugural, he says, here's where both of us are guilty in this war. Although I think one is actually fighting for ultimately the right thing, we still have our guilt that we have to deal with. That aside, when this comes to an end, let's make sure that the Confederacy does not hate the Union and the Union does not hate the Confederacy, but that we work together to bind the wounds. Now, we know that that will not happen. He will be killed. The war will eventually come to an end, and we will go through a very difficult time, a more difficult time in the United States of America. All of it still working towards the eradication of slavery and the equality given to all people. And we know the struggle that will be there. And yet it is indisputable that this country has made efforts and has pushed towards and has given opportunities and made opportunities available that are not found in other places around the world. We can just look around our classrooms, look at who are in the leadership of our schools, of our sports teams, who have high positions of political authority. This is not a Pollyannish, everything is bright and beautiful. There certainly are problems that will remain, such as the case of the human condition, and yet there are efforts that have been made and will continue to be made to allow to make sure that this country lives up to that statement from the Declaration of Independence, that all are created equal. Thank you.